Hello and welcome to another episode of the Circa Sports podcast, the Wednesday edition. I am your host, Parker Fleming, back after a couple of weeks break, and here again with a pretty interesting guest. Going to have a good conversation about offensive line, about analytics, and gosh darn it, we'll probably talk about college football realignment just because I know that my guest today has some opinions about that as well. Before we get started, do want to make sure that you are following Circa Sports across all platforms. We're basically anywhere you can consume media. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. You can check out articles that we've written, sumersports.com/the zone. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube as well and anywhere you get podcasts. Want to also shout out very quickly, won't do the full ad read, but we are brought to you in part by Circa Sportsbook. And they have a couple contests going on right now. The Survivor contest that you can sign up for and potentially win big if you know ball. So check the guys out at Circa Sports, and you can learn more there. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and call up my guest. Try to keep this intro snappy here. I'm bringing on Geoff Schwartz. Geoff, football guy, I think is an understatement. Former Oregon Duck, played in the league for 8 years, I believe, if I'm reading my Wikipedia correctly. Currently has a show on Sirius XM and does some work with Fox Sports covering college and pro. Geoff, thanks for being here today. How are you?
I'm good. A lot of news happening on the college football side the last even just like 2 hours. The sport's changing very quickly, so I'm glad to talk. More NFL. NFL's stable. We have some stability with some NFL and offensive line play. They're stable right now. I'm glad to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is certainly, even if it is the season of training camp videos that allow us to have just wildly unrealistic expectations, it is still football season and it's starting. So plenty to talk about there. Let's go ahead and dive in again without further ado. I want to talk to you specifically. So your playing career played at Oregon for a couple of years. I believe you were on the team at the same time as Dennis Dixon, if I'm doing my
Yes, I was. Yes.
And so a lot of fun out there for the Ducks. And then you went into the league, got drafted in the 7th round and stuck around for 8 years, which is impressive just from the standpoint of being that late and sticking around. Played for a couple teams and then made the transition from playing into kind of being a full-time analyst. So as much as I want to ask you questions about the in and out of your Oregon days and college football stories, I think I want to focus on what was the transition like for you from being a player to and then becoming an analyst and saying, okay, now I'm going to look at and study and explain the game, not just, not play it?
Yeah. So I always knew the end of my career would happen, quickly. And I feel fortunate in that manner because, I had 1-year deals essentially from, 13, really 12, 13. And then I signed a deal with the Giants. So I was on 4 teams in 4 years. I was in Carolina in 11, Minnesota 12, Kansas City 13, and the Giants in 14. So I played 4 different teams. So I always had this idea like, man, it can end soon, right? When you play on a new team every year for 4 straight years, it's not the best. Now, part of that was injury and whatnot. And I was able to get healthy and sign my deal with the Giants. I always knew I was out at some point. And I started building a little bit of a media base when I was playing with the Giants. It's a function of playing New York City, but also the Giants are great about allowing their players to explore other opportunities off the field. They're awesome about it, which is unlike other teams that are very closed-minded when it comes to that. Now, it's a new era now. Guys have social media, and so teams reluctantly have to let guys do more media, but the Giants were great about it. So I always knew that that's what I wanted to do, and then it was figuring out what I wanted to do, right? Every player wants to call games. Well, guess what? There's only 16 NFL games a week at the most, right? And college football, there's 60 in a given. Half of those aren't even on like TV. They're on streaming platforms. Just not all these opportunities to happen. And so called a few games, didn't go terribly. I think I'd be much better at it now. And we just kind of found a path with my agent into radio, into writing. I still like to write. I'm one of the only former players who writes, I think, regularly. And so I kind of find my path in understanding like there was this niche offensive line, very popular niche offensive line group, community online, that I knew I wanted to be a part of it. And then all the overriding kind of theme of what I do, to me, is to try to make people smarter about the game, especially offensive line play. Like that's my goal when I talk about offensive line play. That's why I don't put up with shit. If you're going to tweet me crap, no, like I'm telling you what it is. I'm the expert. You're not. So like that, I'm trying to teach people about offensive line play. So I try to do my best to make it very consumable, very easy to digest. And I have a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that stuff's so valuable. Again, obviously, calling attention to stuff that it's really hard for people to just see. Do you think that that series of 1 year, those 1 year deals where
Yeah.
you were moving teams, looking at different playbooks, do you think that gave you an edge in kind of becoming an analyst and moving into this space, having to, get familiar with a new system, be around different smart football guys, but who
Yeah.
are doing different things, presumably?
A little bit. I did play in fairly different offenses, but I think what really helped me was in college. My final year there was the first year Chip Kelly. He was our offensive coordinator. And on offense, we played so fast that in practice, our defense couldn't line up fast enough. Like they didn't even know what to do, our scout team. So we spent a lot of time in the offensive line room with our offensive line coach, not watching practice. We couldn't watch it. It was unwatchable. We watched defenses. And so I learned really early how to read defenses, how to understand the game at a different level than just what I'm doing, what the guy next to me is doing. And when you start with that base, you get in the NFL. I'm just a curious guy. I started trying to learn more about the game in general, not just offensive line play, but starting from there and moving out. And so when you have that base of knowledge, it helps you when you go from different team to different team. And that's why I try to keep what I talk about pretty basic, because it can be complicated, but there's no point in doing that. I call a zone. I don't call it another random name. I call outside zone. I don't call it some random made up name that I heard another team call it. Like it can be very simple to discuss and still be very nuanced and complicated and show a lot of. So I think, yeah, playing those different offenses helped me learn more about the game. That I think helps me try to teach the game a little bit. But really that base of knowing what's happening around you, because that's a lot of the analyst's work. It's not even thinking about what the offensive line is doing, but the defense is trying to do too, because that obviously affects the way we react to what's happening in front of us, our assignments. There was a clip going out the other day of the two Smiths on the Cowboys left side. They took a guy off the ball, blew him off the ball, and the left guard had a complete mental error, like completely blew it. And that's one thing I'm like, yeah, guys, like that's a good example of like where I'm here. Like great block and all, but the left guard gave up a tackle for loss. And no one even sees that happening. And that's because I understand what I'm looking at from that base that I learned so long ago in college.
And that scaffolding is so hard. Like I love a good football speak of a play. Like, hey, we're gonna run double backside wham with the, whatever.
Yeah.
Like I love that. But take me there, right? Get me from zero to 10, not 0 to 100 immediately. And so that scaffolding is super important. I will highlight, because someone just hopped in and asked a question. Gonna get to questions at the end. Absolutely throw those in the comments, because I know you guys want to ask Geoff some stuff. And hopefully the conversation we have is stimulating and interesting, and you'll ask questions based on that as well. But please toss those in the comments. We'll do our best to get to some of those. Okay, perfect segue right there then, Geoff. What are some of the most common misconceptions that the median fan, not your uncle who doesn't watch football, who's yelling at the TV, but online people who kind of watch the game and are starting to learn about it? What are some of the low-hanging fruit misconceptions that people make about offensive line play?
That everything's our fault. It's not. I think the best part about analytics helping offensive linemen is that the community has figured out the sacks are not on us. Not all sacks. Yeah. And, the conversation around that, I think, has really helped the discussion about offensive linemen. And they're not always our fault, right? A quarterback drops too deep. A quarterback holds the ball too long. A quarterback misses a blitz pickup. Now, of course, we do get beat. It happens, right? They get paid too. And there are times we do get beat, but understand that it's not our fault. A running back sometimes going to the wrong hole, not hitting the hole hard enough. A tight end screws up and doesn't seal the backside properly enough, and a guy runs the play down from the backside. So, there's different things that happen in the game that are not our fault. And I think that's what the analytics community has done a really good job of, is helping basically make that case for us, right? We talk about even Russell Wilson, even a Patrick Mahomes. Like there are times where Mahomes doesn't help us off. There's more times I think not. I think last year did a great job of helping the offensive line, but there are times that even these great quarterbacks don't do a great job in the pocket. And I think that's really been helpful with the community to show that it's not always our fault.
Yeah, and that's that second layer stat of saying, hey, we could just look at the number of sacks, but then realize, not all sacks are created equal. I love the stat about the sack to pressure rate, at what point, or pressure to sack rate, excuse me, at what point is quarterbacks turning those, and frankly, how stable that is from, college to pro and from year to year for a quarterback, that we are learning that it is kind of a trait. Okay, so if you're going to watch a game, and again, talking in kind of that casual fan who knows and is learning, How differently are you watching the game if you're watching it on Saturday versus going back for film and looking at the O
Yeah.
line? Where do your eyes go? That's a little bit different. What is it? What is kind of the flow
Yeah.
of watching a game looking for the line play?
Well, I think when you're watching a game, you see it all, right? I mean, when I'm watching film, I'm mostly just watching the offensive line. I'm just watching that back copy of the end zone copy and seeing what's happening. You might turn to the wide copy just to kind of get an idea of what the defense might be doing. But when you're watching on a game, I'm watching everything. I'm a fan of the sport. I want to watch what's happening around, but I'm watching film. I focus on the offensive line. You can just see more. You see more things. You see more techniques. You see what the defense is doing. You see where guys are aligned better. I can get a pretty good sense on a game film what's happening. Assuming on a TV copy of what's happening. But the ability to just see hands and feet and hat placement and things like that, you can only get that on film. And it's sometimes you think something's a mental error. You go back and watch it. It's not. You think something happened here. You go back and watch it, and it's not. So I mean, it is important if you're really going to study it to try to get that film copy if you can, because that clears up a lot of issues you might have watching a game film and grading it.
Interesting. Looking at how offensive linemen have kind of evolved and how the game of football has evolved, even since you were in college and even a little bit since you were in the league, although certainly over the longer horizon, we have these athletic freaks on the defensive line, right? You've got these Myles Garretts that it's not that they didn't exist. They just didn't exist in this many numbers. How has the emergence of these athletic monsters on the defensive line really changed the equilibrium of offensive line play?
It's not even the top dogs. Like, there's always been top dogs, right? I mean, when I played, Julius Pepper is going to go in the Hall of Fame. Like there's always been these top dogs. That's not ever changed. You go through generations of pass rushers, Lawrence Taylor, Reggie White. Like, you just go down the list. They've always had top dogs. Even in Von Miller, I think it would be kind of like the number one, right? He's going to the Hall of Fame. Myles Garrett's on the way. Aaron Donald, obviously. The difference now is the middle is so much better. It's so much better. I came in 2008 in the NFL. You get 2 D linemen a team, and one and a half of them can rush the passer, right? Now, on third down, 4 cross can rush the passer, and defenses target weak offensive linemen. That was never the case. You never targeted. You never were like, the right guard stinks. Let's make sure J.J. Watt's on the right guard. That didn't happen, right? That wasn't a thing. You lined up where you lined up, and that was on third down. You went to play football. And now targeting offensive linemen that are bad by putting your pass rusher over that guy, and just the depth of pass rushers has made offensive line pass protection so much more important.
Yeah, and that athleticism, and you bring up the point about weak offensive linemen being targeted. I wanted to ask you kind of a question about like positional equality and the differences between it. I think, misconception, and maybe it was true 10, 15 years ago. You think about the blind side and how the left tackle is the best, big athletic freak. And then, you can put, high to guard here, and your right tackle's not as guy. That is equalized out as well. How has that, in your kind of opinion, affected where guys are drafting, how guys are developing, that you might have to move positions, or that it's not as easy to move positions that it might have been?
Well, I think the new way people look at offensive line play is they don't say like you need to have a stud here and that compensates for another poor player elsewhere. It's more about having like a strong 5 than like 2 studs and 3 weak guys. And that's like, I think that's the way people look at building offensive lines now. Of course, you'd like to have 5 All-Americans and 5 All-Pro guys, but they look at it now as like, let's not have a weak position. And if we do, make sure it's not that bad, right? I mean, look at Kansas City 2 years ago with kind of the Andrew Wiley, right? Like, he was, I guess last year he just changed. He was like, if he's your worst offensive lineman, you're in a good position, right? Like, he's the best on some teams, I would imagine, or second best, but he's the worst on Kansas City. Like, that's about what you want from an offensive line, right? You're not going to be the Eagles every year and have everyone be a stud. So you want to kind of build that 5 and not just make sure you have 1 or 2. Now, of course, again, having 2 elite tackles very much helps, right? Being able to have big old guards inside to not get pushed back, that all helps. But this idea of like 5 strongest guys, and that's why I think we're seeing so many players move positions. They get to the NFL and say, look, man, we have a weakness at right guard. Can you play right guard? We have a weakness at left guard. Come play left guard for us. And so they're just trying to find the 5 best, when it was a lot more regimented. You had a tackle, you had 2 guards, you had a center, and like that was what was happening. If you weren't a guard, you weren't moving from guard. If you weren't a tackle, you weren't moving. It's just, and I think now it's been changed to just try to get your literally your 5 best on the field.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense there. It is. We talk about a little bit at Sumer about it being a weak link system. It can only go so far as kind of your weakest link on the offensive line in some cases, and that's interesting as well because I feel like there's heightened mobility requirements for especially the interior offensive lineman for pulling and different protections and being able to kick out and get a guy on the edge so that your running back doesn't have to block somebody they can't handle and all of that as well.
Yeah, the athleticism part of this is fairly interesting. We, as the game has evolved, I think the players have evolved with it. I question whether I would have played in an NFL like this. I just come to the conclusion, like, I probably would have adapted too. Like, I don't know. I feel like I would have adapted the game. But we're seeing too, with these shuttle times for offensive linemen. I mean, if you run a certain shuttle, you're like guaranteed to play 85% of your games and be a good football player, right? Because that's one thing too, the injury prevention part of training now and using analytics. That's a good, people realize that, like, I don't know if we call it analytics, but people using numbers and as to predict injuries and to be able to say, look, like, this guy has an athletic score, that athletic score typically sees players play longer. They're more agile. They're more flexible. They're able to withstand contact a little bit differently than other players are. And guys like me, I got hurt a bunch of. I had a low athletic score, right? Maybe I just could get out of the way of that pile, and it got me where someone else who's more athletic can get their feet out the way, right? So that's, I think, one place where we've seen a good bit of change in the valuation of offensive linemen.
Yeah, and the whole world of in addition to the measurables and that, like, the whole world of sports science is motion capture data and all this stuff they have to look at injuries and prevent them. Just absolutely fascinating. Speaking of that, great segue. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the analytics and film. I think it's a false dichotomy, but it's kind of a dichotomy that exists, especially in the online kind of analyst space. You obviously tend a little more towards the film side of things, but already in this podcast have said some nice things about some potential improvements in analytics. Do you feel like on average, where we're at in the NFL analytics space, how teams are using them is a net positive or still in development?
I think it's probably net positive. I will say, like, the discourse on social media for years was really bad between the film and analytics, and it made it to where it was very contentious. So I don't think it had to be. And I was part of that crowd for a little bit, I would say, but I've just been nicer. I don't know. I just stopped caring so much about it maybe. And I think that I've talked to plenty of people that I've argued with, privately, and we've kind of not worked it out, but to come to the conclusion that we're all trying to do the same thing, right? We're all trying to teach the sport, right? And we go about different ways. And so I think you have to have both, right? Like to me, and it's funny because I'm not calling out Pro Football Focus, but we would get a packet of Pro Football Focus when near the end of my career of, like, they'd break down, like, the film, right? And it would tell us if guys got pressures and whatnot. That used to be done by hand before. Like, we've done analytics before, like we've done that in football. Tendencies, there's the Bill Belichick, Nick Saban, the whole thing talks about them doing this in, like, the 70s with, like, paper and just, like, that's all been charted in the past. Now it's just done with a computer. Like, it's so I don't buy, like, that has changed football because we've always done that. Is it easier to get now? Yes, easier to do, but that hasn't changed. I think where you've seen analytics really improve the game is fourth down decision-making, obviously. I think 2-minute drill and kind of managing, like, time clock management and figuring out where. I think I saw an article, someone the other day, it was NFL team it was a punt situation. I think it was the Giants. They took a safety because they figured out the math on, like, if we take a safety and then we kick the ball off, the distance they have to go. Like, that's great. I think that's increasing your win probability is fantastic. But I don't buy, like, the tendency stuff as much. I don't think it does much for game plans, honestly. And maybe I'm wrong. I could be totally wrong about this. I don't think Andy Reid is sitting in his office right now being like, well, I mean, this is the numbers I got. I don't think he's done this his whole career, right? He's done the tendency mapping and everything his whole career. I'm not sure he's using that to game plan. Now, again, fourth down, absolutely. I think he's hearing, like, guys, if we go for it on a fourth down, but guess what? Andy Reid started going for it more in fourth down when he had Patrick Mahomes. Like, that's a part of it too, right? You have the players to do some of these things. So I think you can do this together, right? Like, film is important because, as I mentioned earlier, you see technique, you see obviously what's happening in front of you, you see errors being made. There are times when you think you see something that you don't on film. So both have to be done at the same time. There's film about grading players based on the film, and then obviously using some of the numbers to help you make better decisions in games, which help you win football games. I think they can be together. We don't have to argue back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And although maybe that's the point of Twitter, I don't know. And if Andy Reid ever gets caught using a spreadsheet, you're never going to hear the end of it from the nerds. So,
I do wonder, like, how many coaches, I know they talk analytics department, which they should. Again, every edge you get to win. But how many are like sitting down to game plan after talking to the numbers people and like implementing that into their game plan? I don't know. I'm very curious to find out. It'd be great to know, like, they'll never admit it, which is probably the problem. They'll never admit what they do. But I'm curious, like, just kind of like on first and second down game plan, how much of that is stuff you learn from the people that do the numbers on these situations?
Yeah, no, and I think it's open. And I honestly got a lot of respect for the football guys, because when I worked, in small capacities with some college football coaches and kind of helping them along different levels from, hey, I can't even open the spreadsheet for PFF Ultimate to like do any kind of analysis, to, hey, we've got this complex question about whether to go for 2 down 8 or whatever. Or, hey, looking at the distribution of passes and screens, should we change our tendencies and maybe attack this team a little bit differently?
One question. Sorry. Okay. So I'm glad you brought up screens. Great. Okay. Here's like why I think you can't just go the numbers. Okay. So I played with Andy Reid. We're 1 year in Kansas City. My brother played there 5 years and won Super Bowl. Andy Reid is the best screen teacher in the NFL. The best. Okay. 27 other teams suck at running screens. Like, they just do. They don't coach it well. They don't execute it well. Not being able to cut in space has really hurt the effectiveness of screens. So if you get a piece of paper saying screens work well against this team, but you suck at running screens, that doesn't make it automatically going to work.
Yeah, so absolutely.
That's where I think it pairs up, right? Like, you can get these numbers, but if you can't execute it yourself, the numbers don't matter. They don't matter.
Right. And I think that a lot of coaches, like maybe the analytics community had misconceptions in the past and still do in some areas about, like, coaches are smart. Obviously, like, they're at the top of their field. They want an edge. They're receptive to new information. The issue is not like that they're anti-information. The issue is, can I make this information actionable? Can I make sure I'm not overlooking something like, hey, we're bad at screens. Why would we try to do that more? That's going to shoot ourselves in the foot if we try to do that more. So I think that the edge is undeniable. And I think about like Chicago School of Economics, no theory without evidence, no evidence without theory. That's kind of how I feel about film and analytics. Is you need some numbers. You need probably a little bit more film than numbers, but you need to have both of those to kind of round out and make sure you're maximizing your edge. Making this specifically about offensive line.
Yeah.
What do you think that maybe this is going to be an opener, a bigger question. So some of the things that we looked at, we already talked about sacks. We talked about Pro Football Focus, and some other folks have done some stuff about like perfectly blocked plays and saying, when no one has a negative grade, how does that affect a run? And, those plays go really, really far, and that determines your floor or your ceiling more than your floor. What are some ways that you think that there could be analytical approaches ideally to kind of better understand offensive line? What are you looking at for offensive lines that maybe analytics could try to systematize or compare across units with data?
So the point about perfectly blocked plays is a good one. Because what I look at first when I watch film is finish. And finish does not mean a pancake, because it's the NFL. You ain't getting many pancakes. But finish is moving your man from point A to point B against their will, right? And the reason I look at that first, like if I'm watching a play, I'm like, oh, okay, who's moving their guy further than they want to go, is because it takes technique to do that. You can't do that if your arms are outside and your feet are all over the place, or your base is like, you can't do that. Hands got to be inside. You have to have your power torqued in, right? You have to strong, you have to feet underneath you, and you have to be able to get your hips involved. Like, all those things have to happen for that. So I kind of work backwards. Like I look at a play, okay, and then I go back to like footwork and aiming point and hands. And so there's no way to really, I guess, grade that. And I know that finish is, and I've talked to people about this that do the grading, like it's not something they really look at, because it's like, did you win the block or not? Yeah, but more guys that finish are better football players. Like, there's better offensive linemen. Like, that's what I look at. And I'm sure you can quantify what finish, just because it's probably different for me and different for you. Like, I look at, and so finish to me is something you can never judge. Maybe you can. The other one that I know we always argue about is the body blows thing. I mean, I will never not believe that it matters. You talk to defensive linemen about this, they agree. Like, just the physicality of of beating each other up all game, it really takes a toll. Like I've been in these situations, man. Like when you, and again, it most often happens when you run the football, but you can pass the ball and do this as well. If you can be a physical pass blocking unit, but like when you just wear on someone physically for 2.5 hours, that last 7 minutes of the game, they are dead, man. Like I've seen the emotion drain from defensive linemen who we've been just hitting all game. And so there's a physicality to the game I'm not sure you can really measure in a way that you like to. So, that to me are kind of two areas where I think it's really hard to measure, but they're and the last one I think is, George Kittle talked about this this offseason in an interview. I forget where at, but he said that Kyle Shanahan designs run plays that he knows won't be successful for later in the game, knowing the opportunity is there for a play action pass or some sort of, and that's what a lot of coaches do, right? There might be a first quarter run in a certain formation where the only goal is to see how the defense is going to play that. That's it. If you get 4 yards or 5 yards, great. If you get -2, whatevs. We'll figure it out, because later in the game, that's an explosive pass play. I'm not sure you can ever measure that. Like, I don't know how you do that, but those are things, like 3 things that would explain a little bit more about how the game and how the offensive line functions. Because again, like like we're doing a formation in this game for later. And yeah, we're trying to block for success. We know that, but we might get a terrible look to run the ball. We're going to run anyways, because later in the game, we're getting that same look. We're giving them the same action, and boom, we're sending the guy down the field, and that's an explosive play. And I think that's probably nearly impossible to measure, right? Because you don't know what that looks like unless you can line up formations, right? But even then, you might have a formation you like, and you tweak it a tiny bit on the sideline to get in the right formation for later in the game. So those are 3 things I think you just can't measure as well, but are a big part of success for an offense.
And particularly that last one kind of emphasizes, it's a pain point where execution and intent are things that we want to be able to measure both of those in football, and we really can't super well. You think about, sometimes if you get the right data, you can have the number of guys in the box, and you could say, all right, are you running against a light box, heavy box? But that's not a random variable, right? It's not like there's a switch that says, oh, this play, the defense is going to be in a light box, or this play that's going to be heavy. Yeah. Those are choices made as responses to how people are lining up, how the flow of the game is happening. And so even trying to quantify that, it's still impartial, kind of full picture. I totally agree with that. I think those 3 are great. I will shout out, I think that was Kevin Clark's podcast where George Kittle was talking about that. Shout out to Kevin Clark. And I will mention, and try to not be coy about it, I would love in the near future to show you some of the stuff we're doing with tracking data, because we're talking about things like this. These 3, I wrote them down. I'm really interested in them, but I think that's really smart. I had another question.
I've talked to Eric about some of the tracking stuff y'all are working on with the offensive linemen. It's pretty interesting. I'm curious how that could change evaluations, because I think players know where we're good and bad on the offensive line at certain things, but presenting data to them like, hey, you're bad on this pass set, like that might be something that changes the way guys prepare a little bit.
Yeah, I absolutely. And again, we're talking about like very small, small tweaks at the beginning, I think, for kind of game planning or evaluation. But I'm optimistic about it. And the guys we have that are cleaning the tracking data are absolute wizards, super smart guys, and doing some really cool stuff. So we'll have to show you some of that. Before we get into a couple of these questions in the chat here, and if you got some more, throw them in there, and we'll get to them. I do want to ask you about kind of the difference and development cycle of offensive linemen in college and pro. There is a gap, and I think in a lot of ways that gap is increasing. There's more Power 5 teams, or excuse me, well, there are more Power 5 teams, more FBS teams. Yeah. How are you evaluating differently college linemen and pro linemen, both as part of the unit and as a prospect for future development?
So it's really difficult to evaluate college offensive linemen. I actually do not like watching college film, and I watch a ton of it for the Joe Moore Award, which I vote on, which gives the award for the best offensive line in the country. Because for me, a lot of times in college, nothing happens. Like, it's a screen, it's a bubble screen, it's an RPO, the ball's gone quickly. Like, it's just boring. Like, and a lot of times you watch an offensive line play, and you're like, I can't even watch. Nothing that this guy does projects at all to the NFL, because they're not even making the same blocks. And so you're drafting solely off of traits. Like, a good example is Tyler Smith of Tulsa. He's now with the Cowboys at like left guard. his film to me was atrocious. Like, but he had great traits. Like, and you see it now. Like, you put him at guard, get him in there, and he's just trading his ass off right now. He's just big and strong and physical, and he's learning the game. Where I think like 15 years ago, you would never draft traits guys early on. You just draft guys based off what you see. But it's hard to pair up the film. You know, there are teams in college football that run inside zone, and because it's going to hit specifically in the A gap, their front side tackle steps inside first and then kicks. Like, you're like, what are we doing? It's not all we do in the NFL. There's not a lot of double teams, like firm double teams, like and so it's just in pass protection. How many teams are like 3rd and 7, true pass protection? A lot of these offenses are going, so fast that like you can't even judge the defensive linemen because they're so tired. You don't get in the NFL. And so the hardest part to me is just when you look at these guys, you try to find a couple of things they do well, and you see if okay, well, their hips are pretty explosive, their hands are where they're supposed to be. If a guy's a good pass protector in college football, in a regular offense, this is the thing too, like I'm like out on air raid offensive linemen. Like I just Abe Lucas on the Washington States at Seattle is like the first one I'm going to be wrong about. Like I'm just out on all of them, like true air raid, not like the power raid that the Riley ones, but like because that's Charles Cross also, both actually, Charles Cross and Abe Lucas, but Charles I thought would be good in the NFL because he's a little different trait guy. Wasn't brought in to run the air raid, right? He was brought in to run a different offense. Like nothing you do translates to the NFL. You're backpedaling, you're throwing the ball 6 times a game, you're facing a 3-man rush. How the hell do I write an evaluation on that when you go to the NFL? Now you're playing against 3 all-pros in 4 weeks and you're on 3rd and 7 on an island. And it's not the same thing. And so guys that can pass protect in a pro style-ish offense in college, I bump them up way up. I'm like, great. You're starting from a good base so far.
Yeah, and honestly, the more I try to watch offensive line film, and me being, effectively a Luddite when it comes to that, I'm noticing that a lot of college offensive line play for the non-Georgias, non-Alabamas, non-even Ohio States is, can I hide the weak link? And so sometimes I'll watch and be like, oh, this guy's doing pretty well. And then I realize, oh, he's really not doing anything. Like he's just not, they're just not blowing things up. And that's good. That's how you need to function as an offense. So that's an interesting point. Yeah, it is pretty hard to do that. Cool. All right, let's get to, I'm looking at our time and kind of heat checking that. Let's get to a couple questions. And I have one, I'm going to ask you one Oregon question at the end.
That's fun.
And we'll dismount. So Lazy's been in here a couple of times asking some questions. This is a good one. What do you think the hardest skill to teach offensive linemen is, whether that's from a college to pro standpoint or getting them ready for college or, pro guys?
Good question. The hardest skill to teach offensive linemen. I mean, I would say like if you're like an easygoing guy, like being able to teach that person to play a little more violent. I think that was my problem a little bit as a player. Like I had to learn at different levels to be like more violent and understand that your ability to finish guys gets you paid. Because that's all difficult. It's all relative, right? I mean, being able to pass protect. I mean, it just being able to run block. You're teaching stuff. I think like having the right mentality mentally to succeed in the NFL is a big part of it. Many guys wash out because they're not mentally capable of playing the NFL.
Yeah, the competitive disposition aspect is a lot of, what they talk about a lot with like high school recruits of like, can this guy get violent? Can he have that killer instinct? Yeah. And yeah, that is kind of hard to teach. Another one here and here, like what makes it possible for older offensive linemen to be successful, unlike many other positions? So a guy can come in and can play for a long time.
Well, I think it's just the ability to hone what you really do well. If you play for a long time, you have like your toolbox of what you do well, and then you feel very comfortable with the change-ups as well. Like it's just more reps, right? It's more reps. It's understanding what's happening in front of you. You listen to these old guys talk, man. Like the amount of wealth they have of knowledge of what's happening in front of them. The older you get, the more you're easy to avoid injury. Honestly, you can feel things around you a little bit. You pick your feet up when a pile comes. Like you understand how to play and just use every ounce of energy to productive things. You know how to train your body better. You know how to prepare better. You know how to eat correctly. And then there is I think there is something that's like a grown man's strength. You get to a certain age, you just like strong. And those all things that I think help guys play a lot longer than other positions where you get that blunt force trauma at those other positions you don't get so much at times in offensive line play.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. See a couple of questions in here about stuff we've covered about switching positions in the NFL, about how the game's evolving, and I think we've touched on those. So
Yeah.
I'm happy with that. I am going to switch to this, and let's talk about Oregon. Let's talk about your Oregon Ducks for a minute, and Dan Lanning and recruiting. You tweeted, I don't even know if tweeted is the right word, whatever. Tweeted the other day that this Oregon recruiting said. Blue chip linemen, offensive, defensive linemen in the 2023-2024 class for Oregon. They have 17. The next highest in the Pac-12 is 7 with Stanford with 7 behind them. And your tweet was, I've mentioned this so many times on the radio as why I believe Lanning is building the roster the best way possible. I'll plug here and say Nick Saban, I believe, took 19 blue chip linemen in his first 3 cycles at Alabama. Not a bad reason to follow. Why do you believe Lanning is building the roster well, and how are you long on Lanning at Oregon?
Oh, I love Lanning, man. They just paid him an extension, which I'm really happy about. It was a get ahead of it, right? Like, someone's going to come calling in the next couple of years. But he really seems to embrace Eugene. He deserves the raise, I think, because, again, you're going to get it on the back end of this. Here's the deal, guys. Oregon has never had a problem with skill positions being good. We know that. Where they've lost games is in the trenches, right? Lanning was in Georgia. He saw it firsthand. They punked Michigan's offensive line. That was the best in country in the title game 2 years ago. And Michigan's offensive line was good. But you have to be able to beat people up with the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. And Lanning gets that. For some reason, the rest coaches out west have no idea about that. Oregon was soft as soft against Oregon State in the final fourth quarter. They ran the ball 18, 19 times in a row. He brought in 10 freshmen, 4 or 5-star defensive linemen, plus a 5-star transfer from South Carolina. You need to have those guys. You need to have big offensive linemen. There's a guy in modern day right now, the number 1 tackle in the country. Oregon's in on. There's other, you have to have these big bodies to win at a high level. We're striving for the top, and we're years away from being able to compete with Georgia. We saw last season, not quite there, but you got to build in those trenches, man. And that's what's holding back a lot of teams out west. There's no depth in defensive line, and they're not out west. You got to go find them. You got to get them from the South. You got to get them from Texas. You're not going to get many guys anymore from California that are going to be these big 4- and 5-star defensive linemen. And so I think Lanning, the ability to build inside out is so impressive. He's put a lot of resources into that. Again, we're going to have wide receivers, running backs that want to come play for us. That's never a problem. But it's developing especially the defensive line, where you got to be able to hit the passer, man. Don't gotta get set. You have to hit the passer. That's one thing that analytics has helped with too, is being able to understand that it's not stacks, man. It's just constant pressure in the quarterback's face that leads to poor quarterback play.
And with the building and the inside, you kind of made this point a little bit earlier, so I like that we're coming full circle to it. You were mentioning that when you were at Oregon playing with Coach Kelly, that you ran so fast that the defense couldn't line up, and that the film from practice was worthless because this wasn't reusable. And I think that the building inside out and having depth on both sides of the line is so important for the development of those positions, because you're getting quality reps every day in practice. A lot of times you'll see a team have 2 or 3 star defensive linemen, and they have a bad offensive line. They're going against bad offensive line in practice, and their development just doesn't reach that full cycle. So the depth there is just so important. Yeah, I love that. Love that you're long on Lanning. I love that tweet. I think that there are way worse strategies than let's get some high quality big men in here and kind of build on the back for college football.
I love it, man. Again, even USC doesn't seem to get this. USC just cannot bring in top tier offensive defensive linemen for some reason. So USC, it's where they all used to go. But now they're at Oregon. So I'm glad he's going the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Love to see it. Well, Geoff Schwartz, thank you so much for joining the Sumer Sports Show today. We'll definitely be in touch about some of these offensive line metrics. I think I would love to get your opinion on them. But yeah, you guys can find Geoff at Geoff Schwartz on Twitter. He's on SiriusXM every day, I believe, at least during the week, and over at Fox Sports through and around the season. Geoff, thanks so much for being here. Make sure everybody you're liked, subscribed, everything to the Sumer Sports podcast, and I will be back Friday with some more good conversations.
Take care. Thank you.